I got a chance to watch a couple of the episodes, and I will say I'm kind of really excited about it because I was watching the Ludvig Borga, shit, I screwed up his name. Ludvig Borga episode before we jumped on here, and the Rebel Starbuck was one of the guys you talked to.
Yeah.
So I got a chance to meet him earlier this year. I did an interview with him. Uh,
Right on.
Learned a lot about him, like just, as far as like what he's doing overseas with his promotion. He's a very accomplished voice actor, so
I
you
didn't know
know,
that. That's cool.
yeah, it was really cool to see him pop up there because immediately I was like scrubbing through and like looking for his like little title card, like make sure it was him. I was like, I know that, like I know that guy.
Uh,
So
Mike Modulati, yeah.
yeah. So a lot of familiar faces, a lot of new faces this season. Uh, Talk to me about what you're excited about. I know it's a new season, but what do what's most exciting about getting back with another season, another chance to tell some stories that maybe people aren't as familiar with?
Well, yeah, I mean, first off, it's so surreal to me to even be saying that this is season 6 of the show, it's so wild to me because I never would have thought in the beginning that we'd have 60 hours of this show now, which is just so crazy. So I feel just like super, honored that we've gotten this far, that there's still an audience that's interested in, us exploring this world and telling these stories and stuff. And of course to our wrestling subjects who are also willing to share their stories with us. So I feel just like, it's just amazing. But there's a lot to be excited about. There's a lot that I am excited about. The Mick Foley Hell in a Cell match. We've always want, which is the premiere episode that premieres next week, March 25th, 10 p.m. Vice TV. That we've wanted to do a story about Mick ever since like day one. There is sort of like a sliding doors. What if sort of story there where Mick was, he was originally supposed to be the narrator for Dark Side of the Ring. It didn't quite work out at the time, and because we had no street cred back then and no one knew who we were in this industry. And so I
Mhm.
think we had some stuff to prove in order to get him to be in that position. But he did narrate the pilot, the Bruiser Brody episode. So we've just gone back with him so far, and we love him. He's such an amazing person. And we've always wanted to try and get his story, for him to be the actual subject of an episode of this show.
Mhm.
And it's taken us several seasons in order to convince him of that. But because I always felt that, while there are a lot of stories about Mick Foley and even stories specifically about the Hell in the Cell that have been told prior, I don't feel like a lot of those other pieces have gone really deep enough in terms of Mick's sort of psychological, like his philosophy, and in terms of how he approaches the weird and wild, wacky art of professional wrestling. I think he just is one of those is a small few that looks at it with the eyes that he does in terms of his commitment to his characters, to the art of performance. And granted, his art of performance is a very brutal, theater of pain, theater of cruelty, self-sacrifice style, but it's very deeply, deeply important to him, and that is his art, in terms of what he does. But I think to most people, especially the uninitiated, they're like, "Why would you do this and put yourself through this?" So, but for him, I think to articulate that, and the need to sort of put himself through that, and through acceptance and what he wants to get from an audience, and also make sure that an audience feels fulfilled at the end of the day, I think is very compelling. And so we took a very psychological approach to, Mick's plight, while also trying to, the Hell in the Cell match was a match that I'll never forget when I first saw it live on pay-per-view in 1998. I'd never seen anything like it before. And I do think, for my money, it's one of the more transcendent moments in wrestling because it tells such an incredible story. Even though Mick's life is completely at risk, you don't know what's going to happen. Is this guy going to survive this? But just the stakes of that match have never felt higher, in terms of the storytelling and how they were still able to, even though they're, things are going off script, things are happening that nobody anticipated. Some people weren't told everything that was going to happen. All these elements are kind of left up to this high risk level of chance. But at the same time, all the performers within it are able to construct this unbelievable story of like a guy going through this match and coming out the other side. And, it's just to me, it's a once in a lifetime type of match, even though it is, a hardcore match that might not be everybody's, cup of tea. So for me, I think the challenge and what was really exciting about it is wanting to devote an entire hour-long episode just to one match and sort of examining the dramatic stakes that are in one match, going into the match and out of the match. And like, it almost could be its own show, of just like us diving into particular matches and all the drama surrounding them and like seeing if the performers are able to pull them off and stuff like that. There's just so much stakes in there. So for that, I'm very excited about. But as you mentioned, Ludvig Borga, like I'm very excited for people to check that episode out. That was one that has been recommended to us by fans for years, and for whatever reason, I don't know, for whatever reason, we didn't feel like maybe there was enough there, which sounds insane as I'm saying that out loud now that we've done it, because it's something that as soon as we put it together, I was like, man, I can't believe it's taken us this long to consider the story. And which is just wild. And to me, it's just it's one of those jaw-dropping stories of kind of one of the more perplexing and dangerous and freakish post-wrestling careers I've ever seen, of a guy who wanted to pursue the wrestling business to become a star and to become a famous person in America, come to America, make a name for himself. And when that didn't work out, he goes back to his home country and becomes this far extremist, racist political figure that actually garners a lot of attention and becomes one of the most voted people ever in that country, voted for people in that country. And winds up kind of changing the way politics is perceived, not just in Europe. You could make a case for the US too. And so to me, it's just a completely fascinating story that I just can't believe it took us this long to consider that.
I will go back to this story, but I appreciate that you kind of highlighted one thing that really resonated with me as far as like telling Mick's story.
Mm-hmm.
It focused on, like Hell in a Cell, we've probably all heard Mick tell a story about, or you've gone to it so many different times over the years, but like this focuses on like Mick's thirst for violence and thirst for that like stardom, grabbing the brass ring, if you want to use that cliche, but like it really put a focus on Mick, his family, how it affected all them. So I like that there was a fresh take on a story we've heard before.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point. I mean, there were many thoughts about doing a Mick episode or doing just his whole career and touching on several different, because there's so many moments like that in his career where he took things a little far and went crazy, even before Hell in a Cell, right? With Japan, the stuff in Japan. So, but to me, it felt like if we could focus it on what really is his iconic moment, the Hell in a Cell match. I mean, whether he likes it or not is kind of the thing that's that fans are going to remember forever. And I felt like that was just, you could use that as sort of like a microcosm of that encapsulates his whole philosophy or his whole approach to what he does. Because I've always considered Mick like one of the wrestlers, as I said before, who approaches wrestling or the performance aspect within wrestling, not just the physicality or the moves, but he approaches it like an art form, like a performance art. And I've always appreciated that and wanted to highlight that, even though it can be so dangerous to himself, and of course, adding the element of his family. I mean, Beyond the Mat, we've all seen Beyond the Mat in those scenes when, he brings his family to ringside during his, Royal Rumble match. And that always resonated so much with me and cut deep. And that was our first glimpse at sort of feeling like, what do family members think of their dad or their husband? Like, this is how they go to work and this is how they put the food on the table, and how scary that is. And so it's something that we wanted to continue to explore here. And I think it's very powerful, like hearing his daughter Noelle talk about, how she's blocked out all of her dad's matches and, how when certain things weren't communicated to his wife on what he was going to do, and she's
Mhm.
having to watch it on TV and find out for the first time. I mean, these are just things we don't think about as fans. We just think about, oh, he's our wrestling hero, and wow, he put a great show on for us, but we don't really understand at what cost, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's something we really wanted to highlight, and that's what makes it a human story and not just like a wrestling highlight reel.
Yeah. Uh, I don't remember the interview, but Mick was asked in a recent one if he felt Hell in a Cell, like the match itself, should be its own Hall of Fame induction, or if WWE will ever induct matches, kind of like I think UFC does it. I know they did something about uh, the Ultimate Fighter finale, like Forrest Griffin,
Yes.
like that
Yep.
fight was one,
Yep.
and he said he agreed with it. Do you feel like they'll ever get to that point?
I love that idea, just for the record, for whatever me saying that is worth, which nothing, but I think it's an awesome idea. Because, I like with this episode, just to even tie it to our own show, it's like, the art, or for lack of a better term, that wrestlers create when they get in the ring and they successfully pull off a captivating match, and to me, there's only a handful that really rise to that cut above, where they do transcend like a regular wrestling program and they become something more, right?
Mm,
And I think it's important to spotlight that, because it is people coming together, technicians coming together, the people that are filming it, the people that have booked it, the people that have produced it. The announcers are a huge part of it, and it's like they're all coming together to create something that's almost like a movie. Like they're coming together to
yeah.
create a performance. And I think with wrestling, there's so much of it is like that X factor of improvisation and lightning in a bottle, and you got to catch it, and then the audience has to react to it in the right way and create even another element. So I think spotlighting all like the genius, for lack of a better term, of when all of that comes together, and really like the performance of it and the moment of it is just it just fires on all cylinders. It should be recognized. Like Hell in the Cell would be a good one. It's a dangerous one to spotlight because it is somewhat of a cautionary tale.
Mhm.
But I think because do you want to endorse that, saying, well, because we're acknowledging it that it's a great thing, should more people do that? I don't know. That is kind of the cautionary tale aspect of it. But then I would go to a match like Bret Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin, like should 100% be in that, because it is just maybe one of the greatest of all time, and to spotlight not just their talent, but everything else that went into that.
Yeah.
I think it's a
Yeah.
great idea. I think it'd be a hell of an idea, and they should definitely do it.
I think those two matches, the Hell in a Cell and WrestleMania 13, like if you're gonna pick a WWF match from the 90s, those two have to be up there. Like if they're not one and two, as
Yeah.
far as
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and and Mick highlights it in the episode, when he said Undertaker's advice was we're creating, and I'm paraphrasing, but like we're creating a moment that's gonna outlast the both of, you know,
Exactly. Yep.
like those two kind of fit that bill. So,
Yep.
bringing it around
Totally.
for full circle, tying
Yeah.
it to the episode, I think, you have something there.
Totally. I love that idea. It's really cool.
One other thing I do appreciate, and I kind of mentioned like seeing some new and familiar faces. Jim Cornette's back.
Always.
Uh, Great wrestling historian. I know people, some people don't like his online gimmick.
Yep.
Do you try to make like more of an effort to sort of spotlight his wrestling historian side, or is this just like kind of like, hey Jim, here's the subject and he gets going? Like, is there a method to the madness? Because so
Uh,
many people get to see his social media side, and I think there's a lot that he lived through, and there's a lot that he has perspective on, and nobody else is going to have that perspective.
yeah. I mean, he goes back to like day one, right? Of the show, like when we were producing the first season, and obviously just being familiar with his podcasts up to that point, the shoot interviews, the kayfabe commentaries, like he just has that unbelievable natural ability to be so captivating on camera when telling a story. And because he's so deeply passionate about wrestling, and I mean, it means so much to him that he's able to make other people, even because there are a lot of people who watch our show who aren't necessarily fans of wrestling. They're just captivated by the stories that are on the show. But I've never experienced anyone else who can speak like wrestling and make it feel like the most important thing ever, And we're working on another show right now that's not even about wrestling. And the first thing that my fellow producers who have seen our show are like, "Is there a Jim Cornette like in this world we can find? That can do the same thing?" And it's like there's kind of not,
Yeah.
And so just purely from the point of being a producer, like when wrestlers talk about working, Flair or somebody in the ring, it's like a night off in the ring, when you're working with somebody. It's like the same thing with him, where it's like it's at this point, it's such an easy back and forth where, when I show up there and I have my questions, you say one thing and he's off to the races, and it's the easiest imaginable back and forth. And it's gotten to the point now where I remarked to him just the last time I was there, like, "Jim, I've been at your house now. I think this is the 18th time I've been to your house." And I did the math, and I think other than any place I've ever lived before in life, I've been at his house more than any other town, that I've ever been to. So we've been through a lot, I feel like, on this show, and he always continues to deliver. And yeah, he's so good with the soundbite and elevating the material. And that's so important, because I think one of the aspects of the show that makes it endure this long is that it doesn't only appeal to, the most hardened fan, sometimes even someone like myself. Like, he's able to speak about wrestling in a way that would get anybody locked in, to the stakes of what we're talking about. So I really appreciate that. And he is kind of the secret weapon of our show in some ways.
I know that as far as I know, this is the first season that you've had that's started production after Vince McMahon left WWE. Have you tried talking to them about getting more talent involved? Just as far as, because you hear the Undertaker here, but obviously it's audio stuff like that. It's presented some challenges in past seasons. Have you made any overtures to the company as far as trying to get current talent or any producers like that involved in the show?
Sometimes, sometimes we've tried and it hasn't quite worked out, or you don't get a definitive answer and then the clock runs out, or something. I would say, because I think we might have done the end of season 5. I think Vince had stepped down because of Black Saturday. We made a reference to it, but we've tried over the years in the past, and especially with the other projects we've done with $7 and stuff like that. But I think it can be, and I'm not saying this conclusively because I don't know, I can't speak on behalf of them, but I'm sure that somewhere it's an awkward sort of conflict of interest to them at the end of the day, because I'm sure, while I know, and I've talked to a lot of people over there without naming names that are fans of our show and they like the show and, they watch it every week. I hear that a lot from the people over there, but it's just in an official capacity, it kind of sets a precedent that might be just a little bit awkward, between our show and what we've done in the past and what we may do in the future. And, so it's tricky. I'd love to, there's so many opportunities where having some of those voices that are still currently in the WWE ecosystem would lend so much. But there's been exceptions. Stone Cold Steve Austin technically, I'm sure, has some arrangement with them, but was in our Brian Pillman episode in season 3. So there's no hard and fast rule. Sometimes things can happen and sometimes not.
Yeah, it's just, some episodes, they're not going to go on record and talk about the plane ride from hell, but
Doubtful.
Doubtful. But you have one I would think maybe Muhammad Hassan, you can maybe make a case because, it was what they put on TV, but it's at least to me, it's more the story of how he caught on, and it's about the character and kind of how his career ended.
Yeah.
because of that. So it's like uh it's not as like taboo to maybe talk about compared to some of the other stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps because it's at the end of the day, it's just kind of a creative decision that maybe most people would look back now as like, it probably wasn't such a good idea, you know.
Yeah.
But obviously, like the consequences of that episode compared to some of the other ones we've covered in the past are very different, you know,
Yeah.
and whether there was a legal aspect to some of them or not. So yeah, it totally makes sense. I think just across the board, it's just it's just a slightly awkward situation. Now, do I wish they would? Yeah, I think
Mm.
it would be great, but it all, but I also understand why it can't
Yeah.
happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's worth saying media, like look how much that's changed because I different events that have happened across the country or in the world, whether it's usually act of violence, but like TV shows that premiere that week, like they'll put up a disclaimer, like they're a lot more forgiving
Hmm.
in that respect
Hmm.
than 20 years ago. Like, you know,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
I'm talking about specifically Muhammad Hassan with like the piano, the garrote and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
people maybe if they don't remember, like it was an unfortunate timing, but at least, maybe today there's a little more leeway to be like, oh, maybe we can do that next week, or maybe, maybe we should tell people what they're in store for, stuff like that. So,
Yeah, and I also think nowadays, like, WWE is pretty apolitical, in terms of how, what's happening in the real world and how that's influencing the creative.
mhm,
And I think at the time of Muhammad Hassan, that was not the case. It felt like there was really, with the rise of everything that was happening in the wake of 9/11. I mean, 9/11 was brought into WWE in terms of the assembly they did on SmackDown, and then they create this character kind of out of the headlines and what's happening with the rise of Islamophobia that's becoming more pervasive in our culture following the 9/11 and stuff, and finding a way to sort of exploit that as a character. But it's such a fine line because while that could be an interesting space to play in, you're still presenting that character as a villain,
yeah,
and
mhm,
and manipulating and playing really off of the fears and anxieties and the racism of some of the fans. That to me, while making that episode, just to touch on it for a second, was really the most disturbing part. Was actually just the fan response to the average wrestling fan response to Muhammad Hassan. Really, kind of was like a black light showing how ugly things are out there. But it's also another story. I can't believe it took us this long to cover because Mark Capani, who portrayed Muhammad Hassan, an Italian,
mhm,
American from, Syracuse,
mhm,
which is in and of itself a whole crazy thing. But his story is so fascinating, and he's such a captivating guy because he had this kind of once in a lifetime opportunity. He had all the promise in the world to be what it took to be a great wrestler, but he was kind of given this, like, almost, not to sound dramatic, but like a Faustian bargain that he made to sort of immediately sort of skyrocket to the top of the card and in the main event picture into going into WWE. But there's an asterisk, you got to play this very insensitive character and this heat seeking, controversial character. But not only do you have to play that person on TV, you also have to portray that character out of the ring,
mhm.
and keep up appearances, and of course that led to a lot of crazy stuff that he encountered on experiencing racism himself, which is just so wild, and so
Yeah,
it is a fascinating story, and I think it's less about, like, at least our approach is like looking at kind of a dated idea, which it is, but also just the experiences of Mark and how he kind of is looking back, hindsight at this experience, because this experience, while it was a failed sort of character that they had to essentially abort, at a certain point, the failure of that character kind of put him on the path that led him to where he is now, working in schools, working with kids, and doing something very positive, which is awesome, to
mhm,
spotlight. So
yeah,
I think it's a very interesting story, but also one that's going to, that just watching that footage back, you just can't believe that that's the stuff that was on
yeah,
TV. It's
yeah.
great.
Yeah, and you know what? One other positive thing is uh, wrestling as a whole has kind of gotten away from the USA Good, Evil Foreigner, Boo.
Mhm. Yes.
So, because that it very much felt like a carryover from the 80s. Like it was like, oh,
Absolutely.
Russians are bad, the Cold War, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's
it,
old as wrestling. I mean, that goes back to after World War II. You know, it's a tried and true format that always works, and it was kind of trying to do the new school version of that. But yeah, it just led to some I mean, heat that I don't know if wrestling had experienced really in like, you know, the five-ish years prior. You know, it
yeah.
was just unprecedented levels of heat that character
Mhm.
got.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll wrap with this. Usually I try to do like a watch list feature, but I'm gonna put a little bit of a dark side of the ring spin on it.
Okay.
Is there an episode or a topic that you've covered so far that, like obviously there's going to be an episode that's a little more popular water
Mhm.
cooler talk than others. Is there one that you maybe want people to go back to and like be like, hey, maybe take another perspective at this one, or maybe you would have liked it to just get a little more love because it
Mm.
meant something more personal to you?
God, that's a good question. That is a good question. That when you've done 60 of these, it's hard to conjure them all individually sometimes. Um,
Like people, I mentioned, Plane Ride from Hell, people bring up the screw job or Chris Benoit.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
those come up, and you
yeah,
mentioned Brian Pillman, but maybe there's
yeah,
one that you just thought, hey,
yeah. I'm trying to
take
think of
another
some
look.
deeper cut. Um, I have one in mind, but I'm seeing if I can top it. Um, um, I think to me, I guess just at the top of my head, just because this is the one that came to mind because I felt like it was kind of maligned when it came out. And maybe that's just the stigma that it has because it's a very particular brand of wrestling, which I understand. It's not everybody's cup of tea. Um, uh, and of course, I'm talking about the Nick Gage episode from season 3.
Okay.
I think that is a good one to revisit, even though I would put a disclaimer of, you know, if you're squeamish, maybe it's not a good idea. But that, you know, episode again was just like in the context of looking at it almost as a film, you know, almost as like a biopic. To me, it's very not maybe taking off the wrestling fan or the purity of wrestling hat, you know, for a second. And I'm saying this as a friend and colleague of, you know, Jim Cornette's on the show. But to me, it's just like the characters are so compelling. I thought the episode was told really well. I thought the editing was amazing on it, and the reenactments. And I don't know. I thought it sort of hinted at like I could see like, you know, the filmmakers behind like Uncut Gems or something like making a adaptation of
Mhm.
that story. Just because for me, so many people were turned off by the fact that it was about deathmatch wrestling, which I get, like I said, but I think beneath that there was a pretty compelling story there.
Mhm.
And that episode I've always found is one of the more roller coaster ridey episodes of the show because it's just everywhere, every turn of that episode is just another like, you know, WTF OMG
Mhm.
sort of moment. So
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, like you said, that's season three. I was kind of close. I thought you were gonna say maybe the Onita, the FMW one. So I was
Yeah,
kind of close.
I mean, I do love that episode too. Like, I don't know if people have seen that one, but that, I mean, I'm a huge fan of FMW and always have been, and that was just a delight to do. And I thought it was a huge challenge to be able to like, here's a whole company's history in 44 minutes, you know. But I thought the team did a really good job at editorializing that and getting across the human stakes of a story through the lens of looking at like the history of one promotion.
Mhm.
So that also that's a good suggestion because that one also is kind of a pet episode of mine that nobody really asked for, but was something that I just really wanted to make, and I'm glad it turned out so well. So yeah, it's another one I would say.
Go back and check out those, or March 25th, season six premieres with the Mick Foley Hell in the Cell episode. Uh, I highly recommend it. It was, like I said, it was a nice, fresh take
Glad you
on
thought so.
Mick's
Thank you.
story.
Yeah,
Thanks for the time today. I appreciate it. It was good
yeah,
catching up.
appreciate you, man. Thank you so much.